Yes,
Good
sir.
morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Max. Great to see you. I'd like to begin by saying that what I'm going to present today comes from evidence gathered by International Alert over the past 10 years. We now are in possession of about 26,000 discrete incidents of violent conflict across the Bangsamoro region, which has been the basis for much of the analysis that we make. I'm glad as well that a substantial number of our security forces are present in this meeting. It will be a good chance to hear from them as well about what they think about the evidence and the analysis of that evidence. Can I request the Secretariat now to please put the PowerPoint slide? Thank you, Audrey. First slide, please. Okay, there are three types of transition happening all at the same time that will spell the level and the type of violent conflict that we will see in the Bangsamoro region this year and the next couple of years. The first is the conflict to peace transition in the Bangsamoro. That started, of course, at the time when the CAB was signed and further on under the Bangsamoro Organic Law ratification. The second important transition is the transition from the Duterte government to a new government in 2022. And that is also going to be a factor for some violence, election-related violence, but other clan horizontal violence that may also occur parallel to that election-related violence. The third transition that is happening is, of course, the anticipated transition from a pandemic to a post-pandemic future, which we hope to see probably towards the end of 2022 and 2023. And it will bring with it as well some forms of violence that are rather more intimate in nature. And I will explain that later on. Next slide, please. You will see here the downward pattern after a rise. The downward pattern in violence from 2017 to 2019. If you look at 2014, that was when the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro was signed. If you look at 2019, you will also see that that was when the BOL was ratified. You will notice that after the CAB was signed in 2014, there was a height, there was an increase in violence, and that gradually went down up to 2019 and 2020, and even up to now. So if those who are familiar with Lorentz curve, that is used to amplify the inequalities that happen in society, there's this argument that it's going to get worse before it gets better. And you will see that almost in that inverted view that you will see when you see the movement going up and then going down. And so is that a good sign? In one sense it is, but I will share to you that also points to some troubling developments that we may face leading towards 2022 and beyond. Next slide, please. Here you will see a temporal view of conflict incidents after the May 2019 ratification of the BOL. And you will notice that violence went down during a certain time, and then it went up again in 2021. Now, what does this signify? First of all, this violence, if you look at the previous graph, indicates almost the same level, that there were some spikes at certain points in time when there were basically periods of lockdowns that happened. And that reduction had more to do with the lockdown that happened than it did with any other factor. Next slide, please. Next slide. If you look at the causes of violent conflict, again in a temporal sense, from May 2019 to May 2021, you will notice that still shadow economy related violence was the highest. That means violence in relation to illegal drugs, illicit weapons, kidnap for ransom, and other types of violence in the shadow economy. The second, however, represents a shift from previous violence characteristics, because for the first time identity went up. Okay, next slide. You will notice here how identity issues became leading causes of deaths. It may have been second in terms of number of incidents, but more people died from identity issues than they did from shadow economy issues. And that identity issue increase is really related to violent extremism, which is a form of identity-related violence. Next slide. You will see how violent extremism has become the most deadly identity-related conflict in contrast to clan feuding and personal grudges. Gender issues is also high in terms of incidents, but in terms of deaths, rather low. Next slide. Clan feuding and land issues led to many deaths and displacement during the period in question. And this is what is happening now under the new BARMM and under the BPA. Land-related violence in indigenous peoples' areas leading to deaths and displacement, mainly affecting the Tiburay but also other IP groups. Infighting among MILF-based commanders, including clashes between MILF and MNLF, and a rise in clan feuding also. Number three, in other areas adjacent to the BARMM, specifically in South Cotabato, there has been an attack, a vicious attack and displacement against Muslim communities by other identity groups. So why is this happening all at the same time? You will see the data on the next slide, please. You will see here clan feudings moving up. The direction of clan feuding has been, upwards since actually 2015. It has not gone down, even though incidents related to other types of violence have been going down. This is only up to 2019. I will assure you that the 2020 data also indicates the same when we made the report recently. Next slide, please. And then you will see here incidents where the MILF themselves were involved in land conflict and clan feuding. From 2011 to 2020, you will notice that in right after 2014, actually, when the CAB was signed, there was an increase in fact in involvement of these actors. That peaked in 2018 and 2019, and then it went down in 2020. Again, the reason was twofold. The one was the martial law undertaken across Mindanao in 2017, and then secondly, the lockdowns that happened as a result of the pandemic. Next slide, please. Extremist violence remained resilient. The statement made by Secretary Rentana is appropriate. He said that, they have actually made significant gains in terms of countering violent extremism, but it still remains. There is some resilience. Number of incidents involving the Abu Sayyaf and the BIFF dropped in 2019 and also in 2020. However, there are confirmed reports of the Abu Sayyaf, the BIFF, and remnants of Dawla Islamiyah in Lanao Sur continuing to reconstitute and increase their numbers. There were some opportunistic attacks following the Taliban victory in Afghanistan. At least 2 attacks we recorded in Lanao Sur and boundary areas claimed by ISIS, raising the significance of the Afghan narrative in the light of current events in the Bangsamoro. We have also monitored the critical events monitoring system early response network that Alert also possesses, encountered group chats using the Taliban victory to inspire and drive the struggles of the youth. There is some good news. Contagion in Sulu and the Tawi-Tawi corridor has been held at bay as political elites unite in preparation for 2022. Seems like the repair of fractures between political elites has blocked war next door initiatives. Next slide, please. The bigger challenge, of course, is related to normalization. It is apparent that decommissioning target will not be met before the end of this administration. There has been a disruption in agreed timelines and commitments. There are disagreements in weapons decommissioning targets even, and they are being renegotiated instead of being implemented. You will notice that the statements arising out of the resistance to continue the decommissioning process until some requirements of political process have been addressed meant that instead of implementing, they were being renegotiated. There were a series of clashes in the SPMS box involving MILF and BIFF, factions causing new fissures between the government and the PTA, and then finally the camp transformation project itself, that is part of normalization, is being threatened by tensions between MILF and rival claimants especially the indigenous peoples. And before we move out of this slide, you look at the weapons that are being decommissioned, and you tell me whether those weapons are the sort of weapons that you would expect to come from active rebels. Next slide. Here is an example. That white circle there is an ancestral domain being claimed by the Tiduray. It is directly being occupied by Camp Bader. It's core territory and area of influence. The second slide, next slide. The same thing is true for Camp Oma, core territory and area of influence. That white portion has been claimed by indigenous peoples groups, and applications have been made to the NCIP, and you will see there the caps right in the middle of the claimed territory. I only use 2 maps. We have the maps for all the 6 caps, and you will indicate major conflicts that are looming in the sense of rival claims to those caps, and that's going to be posing a major problem as well with the normalization project. Next slide. Okay, the second source of insecurity and violence will be the transition from this regime to another regime in 2022. I think most of us in Mindanao are aware of the resurgence already of political violence this early ahead of the 2022 election. We are currently monitoring at least 14 major clan feuds that are related to 2 things. One, the illicit drug industry, but at the same time complexed with political competition towards the May 2022 elections. We expect displacement to reach as high as 10 to 15,000 families on the conservative in terms of what will happen as a result of those clan feuds. Of course, secondly, there has been a resurgence in the drug economy and the illicit gun sector. One is being used to fund electoral campaigns, and the other to provide muscle to competing factions. And that has been recorded as well by the monitoring system. And there is a new cycle of clan feuding and revenge killings, and the onset of what we call multi-causal violence conflict. So it's getting tense as we move towards 2022 May, and we expect more violence towards the first quarter of 2022. Next slide. Then, of course, there is the report of NPA combatants entering massively areas within the BARMM, Lanao Sur, parts of Maguindanao, and including Cotabato, fueling more, not Cotabato, fueling more violence. Violence across the Bangsamoro increasing every month since March 2020. NPA presence may underlie tactical arrangements. We use the term may here because we just recently had another security consultation, and there were signs that that tactical coordination may be less of a speculation now and more a certainty being said by our partners. Trading in weapons and munitions were observed in many areas. And of course, the onset of the election season will enable new income streams for armed groups, including hiring out themselves to political contenders in 2022. Next slide, please. Okay, pandemic-related violence, the third type of transition and sort of violence it will bring, enforcement conflicts. These are going down, but this was the nature of violence at the outset. Residents eluding quarantine protocols, arrest and shooting incidents and checkpoints and so on. Then you have violence from stigmatization and discrimination, medical personnel being attacked. Again, there's been a decline already of these sort of attacks, but they can go up again, depending on the sort of implementation of lockdowns that happen. Third, you find here entitlement collapse for a lot of young people who lost their jobs. And we thought that they would be going to other types of occupation. Instead, they're going to the illicit drugs and weapons market. And then we're worried because the more recent spike in fuel prices that started since early this year, right now, I think the cost of gasoline is 65 already per liter, is really creating a wave of crime-related violence that we have monitored over the past 2 months. Finally, and very important, the spike in violence against women and children as a result of the pandemic. Incidents increased during lockdowns, decreased when lockdowns were loosened up, and I will show you the data later. More importantly, violence towards children increased at all periods during that period, perpetrators included fathers, grandfathers, uncles, neighbors, and other relatives. You see, the problem is that the goal of secluding helpless children created the ideal conditions that made them vulnerable to abuse. Next slide, please. There you will see the chart, and you will see the spikes, and you will see the constant spike when it comes to cases of children. Next slide, please. Okay, what are the challenges facing the BRM? And this is in response to the question that was posed to me. Well, first of all, there were displaced priorities that created institutional blocks in the BARMM that led to violent outcomes. Delays in land laws, the IP rights code, including the electoral code. It had knock-on effects on conflict incidents. Worse, MILF combatants and their respective clans are among the most active sources of violent conflict. You have the problem also of porous kinship ties. Second, there are real threats to democratic consolidation in the post-conflict movement that must be defeated. This is happening now in terms of some democratic freedoms and increases in election-related violence. Number three, there is a need to shift towards a bifurcated focus and a multi-pronged approach. We need to address both peace and state building at the same time, and combine this with action to protect communities vulnerable to extremism. Next slide. There are hard approaches being employed against violent extremism, but transitional and restorative justice processes lag behind. Number five, there are reports of a growing cultural turn to traditional, even conservative values. Stricter controls on the movement and public space of women, especially in Lanao Sur. Attacks against the LGBT are increasing, both in Lanao Sur and Maguindanao, and actions to counter youth recruitment to extremist groups are found to heighten. Finally, lockdowns engineered a paradox. As I said, it was meant to seclude and protect people. Instead, they created victims of gender violence and child abuse. So there is a case for government lockdowns to be made more sensitive to the vulnerabilities of women and children. These are the challenges that face the BARMM. At the moment, those challenges have hardly been addressed directly by the leadership, and they need to be able to work on this immediately if we want a tapering off of violence as we move towards 2022. That's it. Thank you very much.